Hi, I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here.
So today I have a guest on the show, and I am talking to Charlotte Markey, Ph.D, who is a world-leading expert in body image research, having studied body image and eating behaviours for nearly 3 decades. She is passionate about understanding how to help people have a healthy relationship with their body and food. Charlotte is a psychology professor at Rutgers University and a research scientist who has published over 100 scholarly articles and chapters about health issues. Dr. Markey is also an experienced book author, having most recently published the Body Image Book series, the Body Image Book for Girls in 2020, the Body Image Book for Boys in 2022, and Adultish, the Body Image Book for Life, recently out this year. She also recently co-edited the 3-volume Encyclopedia of Mental Health in 2023. Charlotte writes regularly for news outlets such as Psychology Today and is often interviewed for TV, news articles and podcasts including the New York Times, Washington Post and NBC. In the episode today, we're going to do a deep dive into understanding body image. Dr. Charlotte is going to explain why she decided to write books on this subject and her process in doing this. She's going to bust some body image myths and explain why she's written separate books for boys and girls. Dr. Charlotte will explain how parents influence their children's body image and how can they set a good example to their children. She'll talk about social media and its role in body image and how parents can play a supportive role here. And if we have time, we'll be delving into the latest body image research and looking at body positivity versus body neutrality. So much value packed into this episode. Let's get to it. Hi, Charlotte. Great to have you here today on the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely to talk, well, sort of in person, not just online.
So I know just before we kind of went live, we were just talking a little bit about your kind of recent release of your book. Yeah, so just how are you doing generally? Do you want to just give the audience a little kind of update on how you're doing after just releasing another book into the world?
Yeah, it's always a little bit stressful, I think, leading up to a new book publication. The publication date was August 1st in the US, and it's actually, I think it's September 26th in the UK. I don't know why they're different. I have no understanding. But yeah, so leading up, I think I always get a little anxious, like, oh, I hope people like it. I hope that it's well received. And then fortunately, so far, reviews have been positive, so I feel a little calmer.
Sure, no, well, amazing. Well, before we sort of dive into just like really exploring a bit more about body image and all the fantastic work you're doing, can I just ask you, like, what led you down this road? Can you just give us like a little bit of background in terms of how you really got inspired and, into this field?
Sure, yeah. I don't remember a time I wasn't interested in these topics. So I don't know when exactly it started, but I did study ballet as a kid pretty seriously. And I think that's part of it, right? Like all the focus on bodies, especially, back in the 80s, focus on bodies and how you're supposed to look and the real emphasis on thinness. And there was just a lot of disordered eating in that environment. And so I think that immediately kind of interested me and confused me, and that left me with a lot of questions. And by the time I was studying my undergraduate work, I thought I would be a teacher. I wanted to be like a math teacher maybe, and I took a psychology class, and then I was just kind of hooked, and I didn't know what I would do with it. I didn't really think of it in terms of studying body image and eating. But once I started doing that research, it's just haven't stopped. So,
oh yeah. So once you got down the rabbit hole, you were off.
Yeah.
Sure. No, well, amazing.
So can you tell us first then, obviously you're a specialist in body image, eating behaviors. So what do we mean by the term body image? Because we hear that kind of talked about a lot, don't we? But I don't know if many people really understand what do we mean by this.
Yeah, I think, in the research literature for years, we really said body image was essentially how you think and feel about your body. And I've always contended that that's really an oversimplification and that body image is a really central part of our identities. So it's not just a superficial construct, like how you feel about your hair, your body, whatever. It's really much more than that. And we know that our body image affects our mental health more broadly. We know that it affects really how we show up in the world, how we engage with other people. It affects our health behaviors, right? Our eating, our activity level, or even substance use behaviors. So it's not just a superficial how I feel about my appearance. It really is how comfortable am I with myself and in my own skin.
Oh, so is it right, like with body image, is almost like about a third to a half of it almost linked to like self-esteem and body image? Are they very, very linked as well then in terms of like how we feel about ourselves as a person?
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on what study you look at in terms of how strong the relationship is and somewhat in terms of, how these things are measured in different studies. But definitely how we feel about ourselves at the most general level is associated with what we usually think of as body image.
Oh, yeah. So why did you decide to write your books? And I know you've done them for tweens, for teens, and for young adults.
So I think, if you work in this area for long enough, right, it had been almost 2 decades for me, and you start to appreciate more and more that when people have body image concerns and eating disorders, they can just be such chronic problems that don't go away, right? It can be treated, of course, but they also can just be really difficult for people. And so I started thinking a lot more about prevention, right? So what if we can try to provide more information to young people so that these chronic issues don't take root and don't, really devastate people for a decade or even longer. So that was one motivation at sort of a more academic level. And then personally, I started to see my own kids were younger at that time. And we were just starting to read like puberty books and talk about sort of how your body changes and all of that. And I was noticing that those books didn't really have much in the way of nutrition information or body image information. And I thought, well, it would be really good to have a book like this, but that covered these other topics that focused more on mental health and body image and how to take care of yourself. So I think that was sort of an impetus too, just thinking about it at sort of a personal level, like what information do I wish kids like my own had access to?
Sure. So really sort of seeing that gap in the market and recognizing actually that kind of mental well-being side just wasn't really perhaps being addressed adequately. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think prevention is so important, isn't it? Because I think, like you're saying, in a way, it's kind of once you develop issues with body image or eating, sometimes people can struggle then for such a long time, can't they? And it's really hard to unravel that sometimes, isn't it? And to change once you go down that road. So, yeah, I think I'm so with you, actually, right? Anything we can do for prevention is just so key.
And I think, too, there's I'm sure you hear this often. I often have other parents come to me and say something like, I want my kids to feel better about these issues than I did, right? Like I want better for my own kids than what I experienced, right? And I don't know how to do that though, because I grew up in a household where my mom was always dieting and we always talked about, food in these ways that I understand are probably not very adaptive, but I don't know how to do it differently. And so one thing I thought is like, well, this is a very accessible book, these books for kids. And if parents read these with their kids and started thinking about these issues a little bit differently, that could really be helpful. And I have had a number of parents say to me, I know the book was for the kid, but I actually learned a lot too. And that's, exactly what I hope to do, was just help to create sort of family communication about these issues that was just a lot healthier.
Yeah, no, sure. So what are some of the kind of themes that you really and messages that you want your young readers and their parents maybe to take away from reading your books?
Yeah, all of the books are really broad in that I cover a lot of topics, and the thread that sort of weaves the topics together is body image. But I talk about basic nutrition information, I talk about intuitive eating, I talk about eating disorders, I talk about mental health, I talk about self care and how to take care of your mental health. So I want kids to really have a resource that's accessible, that speaks to them in terms of not just, feeling good again about sort of the superficial piece of themselves, the physical piece, but also how to just really treat themselves with respect, how to take care of themselves, how to question some of the messages we get from the world around us that are often very critical and suggest that we need a whole bunch of products to fix ourselves in some way or another. So there's a lot of content about media literacy in all of the books as well.
Sure, yeah. And I definitely would like to come back to that, actually, that focusing a bit more on social media. And what about some of the body image sort of myths as well that you kind of debunk? Because I guess there are quite a lot of myths around body image. Can you sort of explain a bit more about those?
Yeah, this is something that I love talking about as a research scientist. And I've always done with my students when I'm teaching is that there's often, popular beliefs that are just not backed by science. And oftentimes the science is sort of counterintuitive or more nuanced or whatever it may be. And so I think it's fun to take well, here's the belief. This is what people often say. And this is what the research shows, right? So just sort of a basic myth that I talk about, I think in the first chapter of most of the books, early on in all of them, is just the idea that having a positive body image doesn't necessarily mean that you feel great about yourself all the time, right? Like that everyone has good days and bad days, that it's normal to have some fluctuation in terms of body image. And what we're really aiming for is not this oh, I love myself all the time, I think I'm perfect, right? But more just feeling content, respectful, feeling joy in our physical selves as well. But again, some fluctuation is totally normal. So the idea is, positive body image doesn't mean you feel positive always.
Yeah, no, sure. So it's more about that kind of respect and acceptance, really, rather than the land of unicorns and rainbows where it's all kind of perfect and you feel amazing.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And I think just sort of when you're sort of talking about this sort of topic, I'm just wondering as well, would it be worth talking a little bit about the body positive movement versus body neutrality as well? Because I think body neutrality sometimes can be something to aim for more, can't it? Maybe than to be totally body positive all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been so much dialogue about this lately, both in academic and public spaces. And, when we talk about body neutrality, at least some of the researchers that I know, we think of it as not really being entirely different from positive body image, because again, positive body image doesn't mean feeling positive all the time, right? So body neutrality is often characterized by having a sense of contentedness, right? Or more acceptance of the self, self-respect, really focusing on being self-compassionate and having self-care. But most of the researchers I know would say, well, that's positive body image. That's actually not really different than what we're talking about. The only thing that maybe positive body image is really adding is this extra, well, do you feel positive sometimes, right? Do you really appreciate and feel good about your body sometimes? So I get that extra piece can sometimes be really hard for people in the culture we live in. And it's certainly a good idea to start with acceptance and contentedness and caring for yourself. But I also think it's a good idea to work towards, feeling good sometimes.
Sure. Yeah. So interesting, isn't it? So I guess it shows with many things on social media, it gets a bit polarized, doesn't it? With you can't be body neutral and body positive, or where actually
Yeah.
it's more the meaning you ascertain to those different terms, isn't it? But fundamentally it's about that acceptance and peace and maybe sometimes feeling actually quite positive. But that's going to
Yeah.
fluctuate.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I would definitely not say that these are like polar opposites or so different, or you have to do one or the other. Right. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that sometimes I think for some people, thinking in sort of a more neutral way or just sort of focusing on that acceptance piece is a really good first step. And and maybe people can't think beyond that initially, especially if they're recovering from an eating disorder. But I also feel, as a psychologist, and I'm guessing you might feel similarly, that, I want people to maybe go beyond acceptance if it's possible, right? To actually feel good, because acceptance is great, contentedness is great, but joy is better. If you can get some joy out of your body and find more ways to experience joy in your life, then that's certainly what I want for people. So that would be my ultimate goal.
Yeah, no, sure. I'm with you. And why do you have like a separate book for boys and girls? Like, could you say a little bit about perhaps the differences with the body image challenges with gender?
Yeah, I really think that when we're talking about body image among boys and girls, there's probably many more similarities than differences. A big part of why there are two different books, those books are meant for tweens and teens, so like 10 to 15-year-olds approximately, is that kids are going through puberty. And so we do talk about puberty in those books. And those are different processes for girls and boys. And as much as I wish that all girls and all boys learned about puberty that everyone experiences, right? The reality of sort of the book market is that's not necessarily the book that people want to buy as much. And so sometimes it's laughable to me, and my editor and I have joked about this, that it's like the girls' book is purple and it's kind of stereotypically girly, and the boys' book is black and it's stereotypically boyish. And that's not how we think about gender or the world so much, as we want to make sure kids actually are willing to pick up the books and look at them, or they do no good, right? So we have to lean into what we think is going to appeal to kids as well. So that's why there's two different books.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So in some ways, it's more like about the kind of marketing and being able to reach your audience rather than massive
Right.
differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are definitely a few issues, that come up for boys more than girls, right? Like boys always want to talk to me about their protein intake, and they're more interested in weightlifting, and, they have more concerns about taking their shirts off at the pool or the beach or wherever. So there are some themes that emerge more for kids that identify as male versus female, but the majority of the books are actually quite similar.
Yeah, no, sure. Okay. And how do parents influence their children's body image? I guess in quite a profound way often.
Yeah, I mean, the first study I ever published over 20 years ago now, almost 25 years ago now, we looked at body image among 5-year-old girls, and we found that 20% of 5-year-old girls were already exhibiting signs of body dissatisfaction, and that was predicted by their mother's body dissatisfaction. So we know that early in life, moms play a role. And even if they're not saying anything explicit to their child, they're probably talking about their own bodies. And kids pick up on that, right? So if you're disparaging about your own body as a parent, if you are saying things like, oh, I ate too much, I need to go work this off, or, really talking about food and bodies in ways that suggest that you need to kind of control them, that they're out of control, and you have to really exert this, self-control at all times. These are things that kids pick up on, and they start to think, oh, okay, that's what you do. And so it begins quite young, right? With just those more subtle messages sometimes.
Yeah, no, sure. No, it's incredible actually, isn't it? That as young as 5, I mean, it makes so much sense because, I just sort of think of my own children, even when they were that age, and how much they kind of look to you, don't they? Just for so many things, they're kind of, you're modeling, aren't you? Yeah. So I guess there's a lot of might be some kind of parents listening, and kind of mums who are struggling with food and body image and are just so worried about not wanting to pass on these issues, and perhaps being worried that they have already begun to do that a bit. What would you say to kind of parents who are still, in an ongoing kind of journey in overcoming their own food and body image issues? How can they really support their children?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all on journeys to a certain extent with our body image, right? Because
Yeah.
our bodies keep changing across our lives. And even, in middle age now, it's like there's new things happening, there's new things to adjust to. And it's not always fun, right? So I think the first thing is to, give yourself a break and appreciate that you're a product of your own environment and surroundings and experiences. And it's really valuable, though, to then take a step back and say, okay, well, how can I work on this for myself so that there isn't an intergenerational transmission of this sort of normative discontent when it comes to body image, right? And think about, what do I want to model? Do I want my kids to be disparaging of their own bodies? Well, no, right? We don't want to teach body dissatisfaction. So then we have to be careful that we don't do that ourselves. There's a lot that goes into parenting when it comes to socializing our kids' eating behaviors. And, feeding kids is really hard. It's a lot of work, and it's every single day, multiple times a day. So it's really challenging. But I think that there's a lot we can read and learn and think about as parents so that kids can eat nutritious food, but also have sort of a very comfortable relationship with food where they can enjoy their food they eat, not get hung up on, sort of categorically thinking a food is good or bad and demonizing certain foods. So there's a lot we can really do. And a lot of it's the opposite, frankly, of how our generation grew up. It's almost the exact opposite of what a lot of our parents, did in terms of socializing us. So it does take a little bit of work and conscious energy on our part, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, and sure. It's encouraging. So I think a lot of it is awareness, isn't it? And educating yourself. Like, I guess a lot of damage kind of is done when people are unaware, aren't they? So, anyone listening that is kind of very conscious of how they think and how they're worried about saying things, and they're already kind of ahead of the game a bit because they've got that awareness, haven't they? So, and we're all, like you said as well, we're all on this journey. I think that's just so important to really acknowledge that, isn't it? I think it's sadly a very common thing that most people have some kind of body issues or maybe some eating issues as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're all works in progress. And I think we can improve, though. I think that with, like you said, becoming aware and working on educating ourselves and seeking out resources that are evidence-based and, wanting something better for our kids. That's a very natural sort of parental instinct, is to want more for them and better for them than we have. I think every parent pretty much feels that way. So there's definitely a lot we can do.
Time for a short advertisement break. I can remember crying in the doctor's surgery 4 years into living with bulimia. I was desperate for help and wanted support to escape the torturous cycle of restriction, binge eating and purging. My face was swollen, my stomach ached, and I felt lonely and desperate. And I was told that the local ED service had closed and there was no help available. I left dejected and lost, and it wasn't until 2 years later, when out in Australia, still struggling with the illness, that I made the decision to support others in the way that I had not been supported. I decided that I would train as a counsellor and support others in eating disorder recovery, and at age 25 years old, I began this process. Starting in the NHS eating disorder service and in private practice later in my 20s, I was able to put my dream into reality. Seeing clients, families, teaching, and in more recent years, social media, blogging, podcasting, training, and supervising counsellors, I continue to be incredibly passionate about my work. So my latest offering is my Breaking Free from Bulimia online course. It's a 12-step breaking free course packed full of valuable tools and strategies to help you break free. You'll start with understanding and making sense of your past and why you're struggling. You'll then work on motivation to change and root out the ambivalence and fear of letting go. You'll dive into the destructive impact of diet culture and get firmly in your own recovery lane. You'll practice regular eating and stabilising blood sugar levels to create a strong baseline for recovery, and you'll interrupt the binge and purge cycle. And with support, you'll introduce your old forbidden foods and practice self-compassion techniques to become much kinder and supportive of yourself. You'll work on emotional eating and challenging your negative thoughts. And there's modules on finding your voice, becoming assertive, plus developing robust self-esteem and managing relapse with ease and continuing on the recovery road. So 12 modules, self-paced, online, delivered in lecture and video content by me, Harriet Frew, expert by experience, having recovered myself from bulimia and having worked in the NHS and private practice with clients with eating disorders for 20 years. To step into freedom with food now and live the life you want. It's only £111, which is really, really great value. No more restrictions, secret behaviours, shame and loneliness. Break free from bulimia today. Link is in the show notes. And I also think the younger generations coming through are a lot more kind of, accepting of body diversity. They're just a lot more kind of clued up, aren't they? Obviously, they have to deal with social media and all of that as well. But I think they have a very different perspective from previous generations, which is really helpful.
Yeah, I've interviewed so many, probably over 100 at this point, people working on these books, mostly, young people who are teens or in their early 20s. And I love how open-minded they are about a lot of these issues. I feel like we grew up with much more rigid ideas about beauty and appearance and what you had to do to look certain ways. And I really do see a lot of open-mindedness among younger people. And not that they're always doing okay or that they feel great about themselves, but they have a greater appreciation for body diversity and diversity in terms of what is attractive to them and beautiful and what's acceptable. And I think that's a really important place to start. And even though social media can be problematic, some of these ideas about diversity, they're getting from social media too. So it's not all bad.
Yeah, no, so true. So what are your thoughts on sort of social media and the impact on body image?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we have a lot of research at this point that's accumulated, but most of it's not experimental. So most of it's correlational research. And so it's hard to really say, like, this thing about social media causes this problem. Like, we don't have enough good data to make a ton of conclusive statements like that. But I think we can see the correlation there. We can see that more time on social media seems to be problematic for a lot of young people, especially early teens and tweens, right? We see that social media is more harmful among younger kids. We also see that what kids are doing on social media matters. So some of the work we did in my own lab looking at pre-adolescents and adolescents showed that when kids are engaged in very appearance-centric social media outlets like beauty tutorials or fitness influencers, those kinds of things are much more harmful to body image, it seems, than, if you're like sharing pictures of your puppy, right? Like, that's just kids connecting with other kids because they have a cute dog. And I don't think we need to monitor or discourage that kind of behavior because the communication and the connection is great. And even some of the information, not all of it, but some of the information kids get on social media can really be great and can broaden their horizons. So I think it's going to be interesting to see in the next decade how things evolve and how different societies and families and schools go about trying to monitor and make social media, as helpful to kids as possible and try to prevent as many harms that could come as possible.
Yeah, sure. So it depends a lot really on what you're focusing on. And I guess, so what role should parents have in trying to support their children with their social media use? Because I think it's quite challenging, isn't it? Once a child kind of hits a certain age, they're not going to listen massively to what their parents have to say. And sometimes if parents intervene more, it could, the child could feel a bit rebellious and go down that rabbit hole even more. So what do you think about all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely had this. I remember at one point, my daughter, we had told her she could not have Instagram. And so she got it on her phone and then just kept taking it off so we couldn't see it when we'd go to look at her phone. So the problem, of course, is that these kids are actually much more savvy with a lot of this than at least I am. And I think most adults are, frankly, because we didn't grow up with it. Yeah. So you do have to be careful that it doesn't become just some weird power struggle without any, positive outcome, right? I do think it's great if you can delay using some social media or all social media. A lot of this depends on, sort of your kid's peer group, though. If everyone else is on it and a kid is going to feel sort of ostracized if they're not, then you do need to take that into account, right? You don't want your child to feel completely left out. I think that there could be some harm that comes with that. So we want to delay. We want to really work on helping our kids understand things like the algorithms involved in social media. I think we need to do some monitoring, especially with our younger kids. So, I always recommend that if you are telling your child they can get a certain app, I don't know, let's say TikTok, that then you also tell them, okay, it's fine if you download that, but once a week we're going to sit down together and I want you to show me what you're looking at and spend 20 minutes or something just looking at things and trying not to be judgmental, but ask questions. Why are you following that person, or who is that person, or that doesn't seem very realistic, right? Try to just engage with your kid and plant the seed that a lot of what they're seeing is not realistic, or is distorted in different ways, whether it be because a filter is being used, or this person they're looking at has a very different reality because they're a celebrity, or whatever it may be, right? Just make sure that we are creating kids who are skeptical of what they're seeing, and they know they can talk to us about it. So if you start having these conversations and really try to engage with kids, you're going to learn what they're interested in, which can be kind of fun, right? You can see pop culture through their eyes, which I always think is kind of fascinating, and just start to create more dialogue. So not a lot of judgment, but just make sure kids understand that, this is kind of this alternative universe, right? It's not our world necessarily. And you got to be really skeptical of what you're seeing.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's a little bit of a delicate journey, isn't it? Because it's probably planting those seeds can be so crucial, can't it? But it's probably about getting the right timing for that as well. Probably when your child is a bit more open and receptive. And I like the way that you're just saying as well, like, don't be judgmental. And I think that's the hard thing, isn't it? As a parent, you might look with them at their feed and actually feel very judgmental. And it's
yes, of course. I'm not saying not to feel it. You're going
to feel it. Yeah. Yeah. But it's almost like you kind of got to sort of, if you want to kind of keep that open dialogue, you've kind of got to take that judgment somewhere else, haven't you? And go and vent to someone else, or try and keep it a bit more kind of neutral and curious and interested. And then your child is going to be more open with you, hopefully.
Exactly. And it's like 2 decades ago or something when we used to talk about how do you talk to kids about risk behaviors or whatever. A lot of times advice that would come up is like, well, if you're watching a television show and this issue comes up, use that as a learning opportunity. Don't change the channel because someone's using drugs. Use it as like a segue into having a conversation about that. And, I think all of us probably spend less time watching television these days because of social media and because of videos on TikTok or YouTube. And so it's really that same advice, just it's evolved with, the advent of social media, right? So use it as a segue to talk about things that kids care about, because that's what they're following. You're getting some insight into what's going on in their minds. They care about their friends, and maybe they care about their friends' pets, or maybe they care about celebrities, or, if they are starting to watch beauty tutorials or what I eat in a day videos, and that they're having concerns about those issues. And that's when you really want to, I think, stay attentive. Again, not necessarily in a judgmental way, openly judgmental way, but stay really attentive, because that suggests there are some insecurities at play that you might want to try to address.
Yeah, no, great advice. And it sounds like when you have written your books, you've interviewed a lot of people, have you? A lot of young people as part of the process?
Yeah, like I said, I love talking to teenagers about these issues. There's a stark contrast when you talk with, let's say, a 13-year-old girl versus a 13-year-old boy about these issues. I did find that whenever I'd start an interview with a boy, he'd just sort of say something like, oh, I don't have any body image issues, I'm fine. And then I had to really kind of try to draw him out by asking more specific questions. And girls and women, if I say, well, tell me how you feel about your body right now, which is usually the first question I start with. It can be like 15 minutes later and they're still talking. right? Like they have lots of thoughts, they have lots of experiences, they have lots they want to say, and they don't always have an opportunity to say those things. So I actually think that it can be, and I'm sure you find this in your work, somewhat almost therapeutic, that once they start talking, they realize that they have a lot of things on their mind.
Sure. Yeah, no, it sounds like fascinating, actually. And just the power of those open conversations, I guess that in itself is probably going to have been very helpful for those people that have been part of that kind of book research process.
I mean, I hope so. I'm so grateful when people are willing to talk with me and let me, see inside their minds, let me see what their concerns are. It really helps shape then what I write about. But then I include those personal stories in all the books because I do think that they're really meaningful to people to read, that like other people have had experiences similar to me. They've either struggled or they've recovered or they've, you know, dealt with these issues by doing A, B, and C. And so all those sort of examples of how other people have coped with body image and eating issues, I think readers seem to find a lot of value in those.
Yeah, sure. So just tell us a little bit about your latest book, Adultish. So that's one that's out in the US and will be coming to the UK in a few weeks. So yeah, can you just tell us a little bit more about that book?
Yeah, so when I finished the body image book for girls and the body image book for boys, I really was feeling like, okay, there's more I want to say about these topics. And when you're writing for, the average age of 13, you have to simplify a certain amount to make sure that you're keeping your content accessible. And I really thought, you know what, though, once kids are getting closer to adulthood, they want more information. They have more questions. I could dig a little deeper. It's less about puberty. It's more about peers and relationships and social media, right? Sort of different topics become more important. And so that's why I was really passionate about working on Adultish, try to get kids through the next stage of life as they're starting adulthood and have, some, like I said, some different concerns, can handle, I think, a little bit more nuance and a little more depth in terms of the topics. And yeah, I mean, there's just so much I wanted to write about. This book was originally 100 pages longer than it is. So I wrote so much and then I had to really cut back even more. So I don't know, hopefully I can use some of that information in another book someday. But
Oh, amazing. And do you really enjoy the writing process? Is it something that brings you a lot of joy, or is it a bit of a roller coaster of emotions?
I think a roller coaster is a good way to describe it. I mean, I really approach these books in a very iterative sort of process where I interview the target readership, I draft chapters for the book. Then I ask, again, people who would be in the target readership to read those drafts and get me feedback. So I do focus groups, and my own students who are undergraduates have always helped me by reading drafts. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth to try to get it at the right reading level, the right tone, to make it accessible and interesting, but not judgmental. Like there's, it's not like I was trained to write children's books exactly. So that's been a learning process for me. And there are certainly days where I love doing it and I feel always very passionate about doing this work. But, there are a lot of days where I just stare at my computer and, nothing's coming to mind. It's just nothing's happening. So I think a roller coaster is a fair way to describe it.
Yeah, sure. Gosh, well done you. And I mean, I'm sure you must be very busy with teaching and your research and like writing these books and life around it.
Yeah, I do like to keep busy, and I haven't had any trouble with that since I started working on these book projects. So,
oh, brilliant. So, Charlotte, where can people find you or find out more about the book? Like, where are the best places to go?
yeah, so the books have their own web pages, and they're also all centralized just at thebodyimagebook.com. So if you go there, you can find information about all the body image books. And I'm on Instagram at Char_Markey. Sometimes I'm on TikTok at Char Markey. I keep trying to do that better, but I don't know if videos come supernaturally to me. And yeah, those are probably the best places to start.
Sure, no, brilliant. Well, I should make sure that I put the links in the show notes so people can come and find you.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, Charlotte, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for talking about all your really valuable work. I think, so many people are going to benefit from this episode. I'm sure a lot of people will read your latest book and your previous books. So thank you for all the work you're doing and, making these incredible changes in the field.
Well, thank you too for all the work you do in these spaces. I know that you reach a ton of people, and I think there's a lot of people who need a lot of support out there. So I'm glad to partner with you and try to offer that.
Oh, thank you. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did, and do go and check out all of Dr. Charlotte's info in the show notes. Not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out, the Eating Disorder Therapist _. For further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoy this podcast, I would be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.